Welcome very much to this webinar from Epista Life Science. Today, the first webinar we have on a specific subject. It's about the cloud. We have two webinars talking about how to find the proven path to a cloud-based future. And today, the first of these webinars will be with the focus on ERP, so Enterprise Resource Planning Systems. So the examples that we have in this webinar will be based on that type of system, whereas the second one will be hosting in March, will be more on ECM, so electronic content management, with examples coming from ECM systems. So I hope with that that we will be able to share with you our experiences on moving from on-prem systems to cloud-based systems here in life science, and also giving you the opportunity to see several examples based on several different systems. So today ERP, and then again in March on electronic content management. We should get used now to work in this virtual way and do electronic presentations with no feedback from the audience other than what we can get from chats and what have we. But to me, still, it's a little bit artificial to be talking to people and then not being able to see their faces and look them straight into the eyes and tell them what we believe and what we mean. So bear with me if I'm a little bit unsecure sometimes. It's because that I live off that feedback, but I can only get it through the chat now, and hopefully it will work out well and we'll be able to convey the experiences we have in this area. So I ask for your apologies in advance. One of the flip sides of doing things virtually rather than doing it in person is that we don't really have that good an opportunity to get live feedback and also answer questions. And the only way that we can do this is if you have a question while we go through this, please interact with us. But the only way we can do that is by using the chat that we have in as part of the platform we're using for this webinar. There's a small box where you can key in your questions, and then I'll have a look at that box here on my side as we go through the presentations, and then I'll see if I can answer those questions as we go. And I will definitely hold a little bit during the course of this presentation in order to answer any questions that we might have at that stage. But let me see. I hope that you can be as interactive as you possibly can on that, because my aim is to be quite detailed on what we do today. So any questions, I hopefully I will be capable to answer those also. Also, we are recording this session just for your information. That means that session will also be distributed to you after the meeting, and that will be tomorrow. You will receive a recording, so you can use that for reference purposes. And I guess that basically that completes the housekeeping rules for this session. We expect it to be less than an hour, so we have planned here between 3 and 4 to have the webinar. I think I timed it when I rehearsed to approximately 40 minutes. It's probably not going to be 40 minutes now. We get all warmed up and ready to talk. But I will promise you that I'll do it in less than 1 hour at least. So let's see where this is taking us. Let's see how many questions we get. But let's get on with it. Let's get on to the actual content. So first and foremost, why are we talking about cloud, and what position does Epista have to actually talk about that at all for life science companies? And I think that those of you who know us already also know why we are here as a company, and also why we have let's call it the mandate to talk about cloud. Because quite frankly, Epista has been working with the cloud for a long time, and probably we were one of the very first companies to qualify cloud-based systems for life science. And we started for a big tier 1 Swiss-based pharmaceutical company back in 2013 or 2014, where we qualified Office 365 to be ready for FDA use or FDA regulated use. And as a consequence, we have been following this this development within cloud for a long time, but I'll come more back to that. And as a company, those of you who know us already know that we are a company who are basically working to make sure that if we have any obstacles at all, compliance-related obstacles at all, which are basically holding life science companies back from adopting new technology, then Epista is the company who's out there pioneering new methodologies for companies to be able to adopt those new technologies. We've been doing it since 2009 with SharePoint. We've been doing it a lot with the cloud qualification, as mentioned before, since 2013, 2014. And we are working consistently in this area in making sure that life science companies can adopt these new technologies and that compliance is not an obstacle. As a company, we work in the space of consulting. That's everything from search and selection of systems due to implementation support. We work with technology, so we work a lot with different ERP vendors, as an example here, to do implementations that are compliant with the regulations within this space. We also work on ECM side. And then finally, we also work in the managed operations, so the continuous updates of cloud-based systems. How do we make sure that we maintain the validated state of those systems and what is required in order to maintain that validated state with all the forced updates we have on a cloud-based system. So this is the mandate. This is the experience that we are bringing to the table. And my aim today is to share the experiences that we have within this area. And I've brought also one or two, maybe 3 or 4 examples of things that have been done on ERP systems. And hopefully this will be of value for you if you're in a situation where you are moving to the cloud on an ERP-based system. So we are in it here to share that knowledge. We are in it here to give you an update on what's going on. And you are not the only ones that we give this update. I also just want to mention from an IT point of view that Epista is also a company which is widely cited and acknowledged by other parties in the industry. So Gartner is a great example of that. So Gartner also appreciates the fact that we've been working in this cloud space in life science, and we've been cited for the last 5 years from Gartner and still being cited on that. So again, hopefully adding to the credibility around Epista in talking about cloud, especially when it comes to life science. And that's all I'm going to say about Epista Life Science today. You made it. You made it through my introduction of the company, and it's not going to be any longer than this. What I want to do today is a couple of things. The first thing I want to do is to follow up a little bit on some of the stuff that we've been saying for a while. Those of you who follow Epista regularly knows that we have been talking about cloud and compliance for a long time, but it has been a long time since we were here last time. So I think it's almost half a year since we did the trend talks for Epista. Maybe it's even more. Maybe it's a full year actually. And things are evolving and things are changing. And I just want to give you a little bit of an update on where we are on cloud, on the regulatory, how we see the market right now. That's going to be the first part of this presentation, to talk about or giving you an update on some of the stuff that's going on there, some of the trends we're seeing in the ERP space on cloud-based systems and ERP in general. So that's going to be the first part of my presentation. Then I'm going to move on to the more, let's say, compliance and cloud-related stuff. And then I'm lastly going to focus in on how to run a full search and selection implementation and also managed operation of an ERP system, showing you some checklists on what to be aware of in order to make a successful project. And then it is, as it is when we only have a little hour to do stuff like this, probably be plenty of things that you want to understand even closer or even more, then please reach out to us. We have, I'm almost saying, tons of examples of documents within this area, this space, and we are happy to share, experiences on that. If you have something specific that you want to further investigate or further explore, let us know, and please reach out to us so that we can share some more information with you. But let me start off by talking and giving you an update on the cloud, and quite honestly, we've been saying this for a while, and we've had a lot of knowledge network days and trend talks, and I think for the last 5 years I've been saying to everybody, the cloud is here and it's coming even into life science, and a lot of people have been challenging me on this, saying that's not going to happen because of the data integrity, because we are losing control of the operation and the maintenance of these systems, and they are really not applicable for the life science space. And I almost go like I told you so, because how is it with development in an industry? It's technology, and a lot of this development is driven by the vendors, as we were saying back then. And I have to reinstate what I've been saying for the last 5 years. The cloud is here to stay, and we see it even in life science, and we see it even more than we saw it a couple of years ago. So from a maturity point of view, life science is really coming in here and being on par with other industries when it comes to cloud adoption, even on business systems. And I'm an optimist, and I always have been an optimist, and I will always remain being an optimist. And I also said that from the beginning that, yeah, we know that going from on-prem and going to the cloud, for us, it means change as companies. It means that we need to do things differently. It means that we are losing control on some issues. And we know that we will have forced continuous updates. I think everybody realized that now with the cloud and the challenges that brings in life science. But it's also a major opportunity. And we've also been saying that for a while. How was it in the old days? The good old days were not always that good, those old days. Because in the good old days, when we had the on-prem systems, we always ended up in a situation where that system, that on-prem system, was not serving our business well, because the business was changing, and we were grandfathering these on-prem systems because it was too cumbersome to validate, too cumbersome to update them, and the combination of update and validate even more cumbersome. And as a consequence, we saw a lot of companies out there where they had a 5 or 10 years old ERP system not fitting the business at all. And that led to a lot of workarounds and customizations in the business side, which basically was not optimal. The big advantage with the cloud, and that is a change, to be honest with you, we are forced now to update the system, which means that we are capable of adopting new functionality. We are capable of adjusting the system to our business. And the whole release cycle is much shorter than it used to be. And as a consequence, we will and do see a better fit business system over the business with the systems that we have in our companies. And that is really the opportunity that we need to seize as a company when we go into the cloud. So we do see better fit between business requirements and system out there for the companies that run cloud-based systems now. Definitely a positive thing. The second observation we're seeing right now with the cloud being more adopted in life science is that there are some changes as to how we build the systems and how we maintain and operate them. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, but it's of course about these forced changes again. We rely more on vendors. They are basically hosting the entire system. And as a consequence, we live with we are dependent on them when it comes to updates and also to their performance. And that also means that we do have challenges in maintaining the validated state of these systems. Goes without saying. In the old days, we had control of everything. Now we do not have control of everything, and we rely on the vendor for that. And we are going to talk much more about as well. So these are all indications and proofs of the fact that I told you so, that 5 years ago I told you so, that we would be eventually ending up in the cloud, even if we're life science companies, whether we liked it or not. And can I prove it? Yes, I can prove it, because if we look at the way that the IT is going into the industry today, we have never seen a situation where the winners took as much as the winners are taking right now when we look across the different companies here in Scandinavia and also in Germany. The winning platforms, they win big right now in this industry. And some of the platforms are so much winning that they are taking always a monopoly on the subject matter that they are basically serving. And that even goes for business systems. Anyone heard of Viva? So the ECM platform that is currently sweeping through entire world and winning a lot of business out there. Viva's ECM for commercial, so CRM, and also for research and development within life science companies, and definitely having a tremendous market share. And it's cloud-based. SAP, a lot of you guys have SAP as an ERP system. The new version of SAP is called S/4HANA. It's cloud-based and also winning out there. Microsoft ERP, Dynamics 365, it's cloud-based. It's also winning out there. You can't even get these systems as an on-prem in an on-prem version. And then last but not least, TraceLink for serialization, cloud-based, and definitely have won a lot of traction out there. So again, and I'm not trying to be arrogant, I'm not trying to burst or anything else, or boast or anything else. The way it is, I told you so. The cloud was here to stay, and we definitely do have evidence after 5 years in saying we are definitely taking this direction. It's probably going to be my last time saying that the cloud is here to stay, because now we all know that that is the case. So definitely proof for the cloud. It's important, it's relevant, and it's also relevant to talk about the challenges that comes with it. Some more general perspective on the industry and the cloud. If we look at the market right now, the cloud penetration in Scandinavia is now substantial. This is what we see where we go out and do our stuff, our consulting stuff. We see cloud in Scandinavia right now on ERP, on ECM, as mentioned before. And Germany, traditionally a little bit more conservative than Scandinavia when it comes to IT adoption, also slowly beginning to pick up its pace on cloud. We see it as Epista mostly on the Viva side right now, but we also start to see traction on the SAP S/4HANA in the German market as well. Operational models, we have been very, very scared about this in life science. How can we rely on these vendors when it comes to the operation of this and maintaining the validated state of operation? Our experience right now, based on the last couple of years, is the fact that the big vendors, so the Microsofts, the Vivas, the SAPs out there, they really do have real professional operation. So the hosting centers, their operation, their downtimes are minimal. I think it's fair to say, and it's very fair to say, that they are probably operating it better than we could do ourselves when we have it on an on-prem situation. So from a technical point of view, from an operational point of view, there is no questions to be asked. It is really stable and they are really performing well. If we look back 5 years and compare that to where we are now, I can also say with confidence that if we look at the vendor documentation provided by these big companies and even the horizontal companies, in fact, that documentation can now be adopted and used as part of our validation cycle in life science. They are improving it consistently, and most of these vendors now do have life science related white papers on their infrastructures where we can adopt the principles into our validation plans for the systems that we are implementing at the customers. What we also see, and maybe this has always been the case, but a very important point here is that the mode of operation has changed somewhat. Back in the old days, it was always a talk about the project, the cost of the project, how important the project was, the execution of the project, really, really important, and then the operation came in later. But what we're seeing right now, and this actually also means that we need to change a little bit the way that we look at validation when it comes to ERP, but what we see right now is that that is turning around a little bit. This is flipping to be the opposite or becoming the opposite. So people start to realize now that doing the actual project probably is less important than being able to maintain the operation once the project has been implemented. This is really a change in paradigm compared to where we were only 2 or 3 years ago, and that we need to understand also that the trouble begins when we get into operation. Sometimes the trouble begins in the project, but I can guarantee you that where the effort needs to be and the focus needs to be in our implementation is to make sure that the operation of the system is going to be as easy as it possibly can be. Last, but absolutely not least, and I think this is probably one of the most important points, is the fact that we are starting to see also the regulatory bodies kind of recognize the cloud. And there are a lot of different forums where this is going on, and some of it quite honestly, and maybe also quite Danish directly speaking, some of this is really, really bad, because some of this is applying old principles to cloud-based systems. So basically doing old school computer systems validation and then applying it into cloud-based systems, that normally will go wrong. But we're also seeing, especially the FDA with the new CSA guidance that came out of the Center for Devices recently, that they're appreciating other ways of doing compliance, other ways of doing testing, and less focus on documentation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that also, and on how we adopt that thinking into a validation concept, but really starting to show a move in appreciating a standard functionality, for instance, doesn't need to be validated, although it's used for critical use, etc., etc. And in my view, this is in reality the real alibi for being able to, go into the cloud, is that we get some, regulatory attention on this. Before I get the questions in the chat, so I'm just gonna, disclaim it up front. But Klaus, you know that we're not all regulated by the FDA. Yes, I do know that, and I also know that it's an FDA initiative. On the other hand, the CSA guidance basically shows a trend in the regulatory environment, and it's coming out of Center for Devices. And I think some of you may remember their last, let's say, the last significant documentation coming from the Center for Devices. That was 21 CFR Part 11. So they've also always been pretty strong at computer systems validation. So I think it makes sense to pay attention to what they're saying from the Center of Devices. So yeah, I think you should follow that channel if you're not following it already, because it's pretty interesting stuff coming there. But also, what we call sound reasoning coming out. So that was a bit of an update on the market side, and let me just focus a little bit on the change of implementation and the change into a more, let's say, a more rigid operational model on these cloud-based systems. And that is around two things. It's the project execution. It's about the vendor role, and I think those are the two things that have changed most when we talk about cloud-based systems. So the first one we can talk about is the vendor role. Since the vendor is now running a lot of the stuff, and we are relying a lot on the vendor, we also need to rely on the vendor documentation, and that's definitely a change in paradigm compared to where we were. So you need to prepare yourself for being able to rely on that vendor for continuous operation of the system. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. And then secondly, because the vendor landscape is also changing a bit on ERP now, we also need to rely on the integrator or the system implementer for project support and system operations. So this is a little bit new. We're going to talk more about that. And then on the project execution side, and I was alluding a little bit to it before, the project, which used to be the flagship of everything we did years ago, is now only the preparation for operation. Now, this is where it really happens, is to be able to follow these continuous updates. We need to focus, and we'll talk about that, the validation strategy. It must be closely planned because the impact on operation is considerable. If we test too much, then we'll die in regression testing, and regression testing is quite paramount when we are to operate these systems moving forward. That is the update on that. We have found that in implementing and running a cloud-based system, and if you want to be successful in that, in theory it's simple. It's a lot of work, but in theory it's simple. But we have to look after 4 different main disciplines, and we need to control those. And it's about processes, it's about applications and support of the platform that you are basically installing. It's about validation, and then of course it's about the operation. If we control these 4 disciplines, we're in a situation where we can actually continuously improve the system, hence making sure that it fits with the business. We can change it, and we can make sure that it's always compliant. And a little bit more detail on that. What it comes down to is that once you know what system you need to install, and let's say it's an ERP system because we are talking about ERP today, it is so important that someone, either you or the vendor or someone else that are as part of the implementation, knows those 120 GMP critical processes and know how they should be implemented in your systems, and make sure that those are compliant. Those processes, we need to know exactly how we handle them from a business point of view. On the application side, And let me talk about ERP here again. Most of the vendors here come up with ERP systems that are, they are horizontal. They can work on any industry vertical, also on life science. But most of these, and let's take SAP as an example here, would have a life science best practice, which would be the very first point in the implementation. You better use that one because it has most of the considerations you're having fixed. It's not done, but they definitely have it. If we go to Microsoft Dynamics 365 as another example, there are actually packages out there. DSP package, which has weighing and dispensing functionality, process functionality around which is life science specific. And you should definitely also take a look at that, whether it applies to your business or not, in order to get as much application or best practice support as you can for the implementation. On the validation side, don't validate too much. Validate the functionality, but make sure that you prepare for operations. So a rigid validation setup will definitely kill you, and it will kill you. Make sure that we use the vendor documentation. If we have our own documentation and the vendor documentation, use the vendor documentation. That is really, really important. And then apply risk assessment, and we will talk about that later. Not the usual GAMP-oriented risk assessment principles where we do it for fun, but literally go down, make it two-dimensional, and make sure that we de-risk as much as we possibly can and validate only what's important. And then on the operations side, make sure that you already in the beginning of the project get a robust model for the forced changes, because not only will the system change once it's under operation, it will actually also change during the course of the project because the project is long. So this is really, really important that robust model is one of the first things we do. Focus on regression testing, focus on good change management and good release management. We're going to come back to that also, and then around test management or test automation, sorry. If you are capable of controlling these four disciplines, then I want to guarantee you, then you are in a better shape than you would be if you did not have the overview of it. And then the chance of success is much, much higher than is the case if you look aside from these four disciplines. This is the update on the cloud, the market, ERP. It's a suggested model with 4 different disciplines to put under control for implementation. And I see no questions coming in the chat, so hopefully that's a good sign. I want to then dig into the part of it where we talk about cloud-based ERP and how we handle the validation of cloud-based and implementation of cloud-based ERP moving forward. So let's have a look at that. And I don't know how many of you are actually aware of what the structure is like in a cloud-based system. And in the old days, we talked about IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. And there were definitely different definitions of that. To me, from a validation point of view, it's always almost all the same. And when we're in the ERP space, the main challenge here is that we have something, a platform, a system, some software that is being developed by a vendor, which is being operated by a vendor, and they are basically liable for everything that's going on there. So that's typically a stack consisting of network, storage, servers, etc. All is out of your sight. It's run by the vendor, and we have to rely on the software as a service vendor on that. And then we have some configurations. The configurations would be our forms, our workflows, our master data structure, our whatever is specific for us. And we, of course, are liable and in control of those configurations, although it's sitting on the vendor's platform. And it goes without saying that if we look at how to validate these two things, we need to handle those two things separately in the validation approaches that we define for an implementation of an ERP system. And first and foremost, we need to accept the fact that the vendor is in control of some of it. So the platform, the software as a service, the stack is responsibility of the vendor. We need to figure out and understand and acknowledge and even appreciate that there will be forced changes to that platform. And as a consequence, we need to be in control of that. And then we need to establish evidence of control of the platform. So those are basically the 3 learning points from the vendor side of things. And then we have the configurations. They are individual, they are ours, and we need to be in control of the configurations. And since the platform is updated 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 times a year, then we need to make sure that we understand the regressions. So what would the changes, impact of the changes be on our systems as it is? So this is important to realize and appreciate. And I've said it a lot of times now today, and even before today. It's very much about the vendor. The vendor really plays a significant role in cloud-based systems, and therefore we also need to appreciate that fact in our projects and make sure that we understand who's doing what. From the vendor side, there are at least 2 partners or 2 parties that we need to address when we talk about ERP. One is the software provider. That's basically SAP or Microsoft. They are typically responsible for the system, the development of the software. They are responsible for the general functionality, some of it not even life science specific. They need to be addressed in a certain way in order for us to do things right. And then we most certainly and most often also have the implementation partner, who is a provider of implementation services. So he will be configuring the software from SAP and Microsoft, and he will be doing the workshops with us or the customers, and he will be understanding your business, your GXPs, etc., etc. And I'm just being very honest here. A lot of these implementation partners, they say that, oh yeah, we have a lot of experiences from life science, and I'm sure that they have, and I'm sure that they are not lying. But the way these companies work is that they are very horizontally organized. So they work for life science, they work for food, they work for, I don't know, automotive, and as a consequence, their quality management systems are not really, let's say, in a shape where we can adopt it directly into life science. So the repeatability is not what we are used to in life science. So as a consequence, we need to make sure that that implementation partner, to some extent, is giving advice or audited, or being under a certain amount of control. And we found that the way to work with an implementation partner that is efficient very often is to provide them with a quality plan where we basically address which part of the process framework they're using, how they do document management, etc., etc. Make that quality plan for that implementation partner, and then perform an audit of that implementation partner, so that the implementation partner also knows which part of their QMS that they're using to deliver projects for life science companies. I think we've done this now 6, 7 times, and it is a very good way of qualifying that vendor or that implementation partner to actually be capable of delivering. So I'm not sure if you can see, maybe you can see the challenges that we have here. So we have the software provider, they deliver the software, they deliver the operation. We have the implementation partner, they deliver the project, the implementation, the workshops, and then we have our life science requirements. And how do we cope with that in terms of a project? How do we make sure that the software provider understands what he needs to do, that the implementation partner understands what he needs to do in terms of validation, and how do we make sure that we get everything on the right track, have the right plan before we actually begin the project? And what we suggest and normally do and recommend here is to include a small phase 0, if you understand what I'm saying, before the project. So you go out, you do your RFP on the ERP project, kind of find the provider that you are courting, to be honest, and you find the implementation partner that you like. Spend some time in understanding what is the documentation that software provider is bringing to the table. How is the implementation partner working? What part of the QMS is he using? How do we put the validation on top of that, so that everybody knows exactly what they're intended to do before we start the project? And normally a phase 0 where we do the validation plan as part of that actually makes it possible for us to utilize vendor documentation as much as possible, and at the same time making sure that everybody understands what they should do and what they should not do. If we don't do this, and I've also tried that, it's never successful, because people will be running around asking who's doing what. So we need that validation plan very, very early in the project. And by the way, it needs to also have the operation there. So I have put in a simple checklist for ERP vendors. Of course, it's in the same 4 disciplines that we talked about before. It's about the processes. Do they have specific library for your line of business? Do they have competence within the business side, GXP, et cetera, on the application side, on the validation side, and on the operation side? And you can just keep this for reference purposes, but quite good questions to ask when you're going in there. And all of the results of these questions, and of course more than the ones on the slide, basically gives you the input to a validation plan where we know exactly what's going on in the project. And let's move on a little bit on that, because how is it with those vendors? We need to rely on them, but their role has changed now in the cloud. So they are producing quality standard software. We need to use some of the documentation as reference documentation. And we also need their ability to serve as operational partners for us, basically running our infrastructures and systems. So the old school auditing principles, we need to do something about them. We need to extend them. And then here is also a suggestion, recommendation to how we can do that. So it's about going to SAP, going to Microsoft, and of course check that they can do good software development, but I can assure you they can. Looking at the system implementation partner or integrator for project implementation methodology, and then make what we call an extended risk assessment of the SaaS operational model, what we call a cloud qualification. And after that, establish a quality plan for the implementation partner. An overview of who does what is really, really important here. And let's talk a little bit about this extended risk assessment of the operational model, because it's really, really crucial also to do it early in the project, because we need to understand the software vendor's capability of running the system, and we need to map that against 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11 or SOX or whatever regulatory requirement we have. And we have found that making a risk assessment based on, for instance, ITIL on the different processes we have during operation, and then map these regulations to that, is a very, very powerful tool in understanding what we need to do in order to build the control around the platform and the operation of the platform. And we have 9 dimensions that we put in these risk assessments all the time. So it's the overall regulatory operational requirements. So within change management, for instance, what is required from the authorities. Looking at the standard documentation that we can get from the vendor. So for instance, in Microsoft, we can get a white paper, GXP white paper. What is their interpretation of that regulatory requirement? Do we have a potential gap on that? Do the system implementer have a specific gap? How do we handle those gaps as part of the project? Is there a reference to our own process, or do we need to make a new process that we can refer to? Does the supplier need to have a process, and if he has to have that process, do we need to refer to it? Is it covered by the SLA? And is there something that we need to have in terms of mitigation actions to make sure that if something happens at the vendor side, that we are able to figure it out or control it or discover it? And what we usually do during ERP projects is to record that list in Microsoft Excel, very sophisticated tool. We will map the process responsibility for each of those IT processes to you as a customer, to SAP as the vendor or the system implementation partner. And then we define an annual control wheel as a consequence of that with those mitigation actions. What do we do on a daily basis? What do we do on a weekly basis? What do we do on a monthly, quarterly, half yearly, and a yearly basis? And it could look something like this, or it does look something like this. And this is a Dynamics 365 example. And the 2 lines I have here is specific for change management and configuration management. So what is the process? What's the overall requirement? What do we need in terms of the requirements from the regulatory bodies? If we ask the vendor, in this case Microsoft and the Microsoft and Azure GXP guidelines, what is the responsibility of the customer in order to comply with that? We write that down. And if you follow the track across, you can see that it all comes into what is the gap? Is the gap with us? Is it with the implementation partner? Is there a reference to a specific SOP that we need to develop during the course of the project? Is there a supplier process that we need to reference? Is this governed by the SLA? And then finally, figure out what is the mitigation of the residual risk, and then define actions, which basically makes it possible for us to control and monitor this when we go live with the system. So I know this is very low technical, which is, I think, good, because it's very, very efficient in having a good strategy for the operation of a cloud-based system. And when the inspector comes in and says, what are you going to do with this? We show him this Excel sheet and I say, dear Mr. Inspector, we did our risk assessment. These are our findings. This is what the vendor controls. This is how we monitor it. And this is how we discover if something is wrong. Very, very powerful tool. We developed that back in the beginning of 2014, and we have continuously improved on it. And we do have it now for both SAP. We have it for we also have it for Microsoft. I even think we have it for Oracle. So we'll try to adopt these, let's say, white papers into this spreadsheet. And it basically goes in the direction of what the FDA is saying right now regarding the new concept, what they call CSA, so Computer Systems Assurance, which is, let's say, another version of what we used to have, which was Computer Systems Validation. And then those of you following that would know, and the rest I will tell you now, that what if the FDA is really trying to do. I have some quotes coming out of the task force that work with the CSA concept. They want us, and I think this is really common sense and really nice to see from the FDA here. We want companies to spend more time on testing and less time on documentation. How many times have we been doing documentation instead of doing real testing? How many times have we been doing screen dumps and what have you to document our testing? This is surely a paradigm change in paradigm from the FDA here. We've been spending, and this is the lower triangle, been spending time on documentation, less time on testing activities, even less time on assurance needs, and we didn't spend time at all almost on critical thinking in our risk assessments. And they basically want to turn that around. They want to see us do more risk assessments. You saw my Excel sheet. That was an example of a risk assessment. If we do a lot of that, and we build in the assurance needs and the controls, as I showed you, then we can do less test activities, and then finally we can do less documentation. So that's one thing that is coming out of that, and I think that rhymes very well with what I showed you before around the operation side of things. What I also think is really important and also very, very new from the FDA is that it gives us new ways of looking at risk assessments and actually a more common sense approach. I'm really happy to see this because we've been doing this for a while here and trying to write rationales that basically support another way of looking at risk assessments. But it's two-dimensional. So it talks about the technology stacks on the left-hand side. So is this an out-of-the-box functionality? Is this something that we configure, or is this something that we build from new? You might remember GAMP had originally 5 different categories, and then that basically was taken down to 4. Now we are with the FDA guidance here, taking it down to 3. And I think this also rhymes very well with the cloud way of looking at things. Out of the box now is a lot. It's sitting on the SAS platform. We are configuring something that is relevant for us, and we do very little custom code now because it's too hard to maintain. So really a good definition on implementation coming from the FDA here. And then on the other side, we have what I call the GXP risk. You may also recall that in the old days, we had GAMP. We were talking about patient risk, product quality, and even data integrity. And what the FDA from Center Devices is saying right now is we are going to only look at the patient risk. And then we are going to have this matrix which basically talks about is it low, medium, high, and even none. And then depending on whether this is out of the box, configured, or custom, we can have different risk groups. And even better than that, the FDA also has an opinion on what to do with these different groups. So if we take a typical ERP system, we would be in the green, and in the yellow part of the implementation definition, we would have the fits sitting in the out of box, we would have the gaps sitting in the configured box. And then we can see that we would have on the implementation method, even for a high patient risk, we would get into category 3 and 4 on that, which would mean that we would have to do requirement validated through unscripted testing, which can be automated, or we could have the requirement validated through limited scripted testing, which would be something that we would be doing on paper or automated, or maybe even the combination of the two. So really stepping back from the old, requirements around documentation to have a more common sense approach. And they're not saying that we should spend less time on validation. That's not what they're saying. They're saying we should spend the time that we are spending, we should spend it better. So rather have 10 automated test scripts and run them all the time. And we would prefer that rather than having one paper protocol that's run once a year. So that's basically what we're looking at here. And personally, I think that this is exactly the right path to take for FDA in a situation where we have more and more cloud-based system coming out there, where we actually do have forced changes on those, where we will be forced to test that in a more, let's say, sensible way than before. I mean, in the beginning, Microsoft came out with Dynamics 365 and said that we would have an update every month on a life science project with a full ERP system. Just execution of the PQs associated to that system would take more than a month. So definitely we need to do something to automate, but also to look into that we can use risk assessment more or use it better in order to minimize the amount of documentation and automate the maximum number of the test groups we have here. So again, as I said before, I know this is not European regulations, and I know this is FDA, and I know this is only guidance, but it paints a trend, and I think that trend is important. And I can tell you that we've been working along the lines of this for some years now in having two-dimensional risk assessments on ERP, and it works, and it can be audited. So it really does make sense. And let's talk a little bit about that also, because I have an example of that also. This is also a Dynamics example, Dynamics 365. What we find to be very, very, very efficient on the requirement side is to use the same concept, so two-dimensional risk assessment, and divide your requirements into a 2x2 matrix from a risk perspective. One is a GXP or non-GXP on the functional side, and then look at the technical side and see, is this an ERP fit on the system that you have chosen, or is it a gap? And depending on where you are in these four categories, we can go on the right-hand side of this slide and then go to the V model and say, if we have a non-GXP fit, we don't have to do too much documentation around that. So we might probably see a URS on that specific thing. And then if we go down the V model, we end up in a UAT. We actually use the term UAT, not PQ, even though it's the same. But we use the term UAT not to confuse the vendor. And then we say we can validate it by that. Whereas if we have a GXP critical requirement, which is a gap, we want to see a URS and a process description. We want to see an FDD, which is a functional design document. We want to see a test case on that. We probably want to see deployment procedure reports, and we want to see a unit test, excuse me, a unit test protocol, etc., on those, because from a, let's say, complexity point of view, it's more complex, and then it should be treated differently. And yeah, and there are approximately 120 processes in a life science, full life science company, which are GXP critical. And depending on what you need to achieve, yeah, some of them, those will be fits, and some of those will be gaps. But all the fits, we are doing less documentation for them compared to what we do for other stuff. So, excuse me. So this is very, very, very important in terms of the scope creep on these types of systems. Second one, equally important, is that we recommend to use the vendor documentation on the design side and also on the test side. Why not? That implementation partner, he will be pretty good, or she will be pretty good in doing ERP implementations. And they are pretty good at doing specifications as well, and they make sense in their implementation. So let's use them, and let's not do anything on top of that or writing new specifications, adopt a gap notation on those. Keep it with the vendor, let him do that. He's better at that than we are, so they better do that. And then we do something on the validation side instead, and strengthen the UAT tests compared to what they usually do on the GXP gaps. We also, and we have investigated this a lot. We have gotten a lot of experiences on this, both good and bad, on how to do things and how not to do things. But our recommendation is that if we look at the OQ and the PQ, then automate them, because then they can be used for regression tests later. But look into having, for instance, the GXP gaps done automatically. Then you will be able to run those when you get an update. When you get in the operational state, you just execute that test, and that will help you ease the validation around the forced updates. Also, based on experience, when you're in the project, you're running all the V models, pay attention to the fact that your project probably will be 12 months, maybe even longer than 12 months. And the cloud is not, it's not at a standstill during the course of that project. It will change because you're a software as a service. So that needs to be incorporated into your project model as well. Be careful with the baselining before every test, because it might potentially be on another release than the last one you made. And then one more thing, use the tools that you have in the ERP project to control the builds. So for Dynamics, this is DevOps. Use it wisely to control the different configuration elements and items you have in your technical part of the solution. In SAP, it would be Solution Manager, and you can also use it for traceability. But you will be writing your documents in Word, and I've seen a lot of people trying to update Solution Manager to incorporate the document management features. You don't want to go in that direction. It becomes really, really complicated, and you should be using those systems for what they were built for. And both DevOps and Solution Manager are technical systems. They are built for maintaining, the configuration, technical configuration items. And some people say, yeah, but also documentation. Yes, and that's true, but only finished documentation that needs to be put in there. And this is how we like to see this. The operation, I said it before, automating the OQ and the PQ, and I think those of you who may have heard me speak before, think about it. You're an FDA inspector or even a European inspector. You're coming into a pharma company and you are experiencing that they are doing the cloud. You're asking them, how do you control the different updates? If we have automated the OQ and the PQ, we can just run the OQ and the PQ automatically every time we get an update. It needs to be maintained, of course, but we still can do it. That is the ultimate proof of control of the system, that we are always having the last version with a PQ that was approved as part of the project and maybe being revised as part of the operation. So I really recommend that as well. Look at that automated testing for regression purposes. Once you have the update, you're in a situation where you can, just is put in quote here, but just can do the test just right after the forced change has been implemented on the system. If you think this through, by the way, the automated test can also be used as a means to do regression analysis. So here's the system, here's a new update. In the test environment, you just run the automated PQ, and the deviations that's coming out of that, you know what? Those are the things that have changed on your system. So rather than looking into your release notes and what have you from Microsoft or SAP, you know immediately this is where the system differs, and you can use that automated testing capability as a regression analysis tool rather than a regression testing tool. Really, really efficient, really, really powerful. This takes me to the last part of the presentation, which is about the operational model and the whole challenge about maintaining the validated state. I said it 100 times already in this presentation that the actual platform is governed by the vendor. But I also told you that we could put the controls in place using that Excel sheet. Those controls monitor the vendor and make sure that if he gets out of control, then we know it. We have done all the SOPs and processes to be able to capture the change and release management of the system. So we are in really, really good control if we do it the way that I suggested before. And with that annual control wheel, what are we doing on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly basis? We have good control over that, and we are capable of showing that to the regulators as well. And with the automated testing and the regression, we're actually also capable of maintaining that validated state with a very high certainty and also with better quality than we had before. But there are still two main challenges. I actually think that came back from the poll that we had out before this presentation. Some of you said, well, what is the main challenge here? And these are what comes out to be the major challenges for you when you're operating this. So it's point number one, evaluation of software changes and the new functionality, and the gap and fit analysis, with your system on that. And then of course a regression test, but I think we talked to that already. We find that a good recommendation here is that you need to be very, very careful in your operation to have in change management and release management people that know about GXP and GXP criticality, who can basically assist the process evaluating those software changes and the new functionality as part of the change management process. If you have a technical guy sitting there, there may be things that you're overlooking, but you have someone there who is basically GXP savvy. You will end up in a much smoother way of looking at that and operating that, during the course of operation. And there will be documentation that needs to be updated, obviously. So those were 55 minutes going through an ERP implementation project and even the operation of it. And I know that this is only like a small peep under the hood of the wonderful world of ERP implementations. But still, I hope that it gave you enough perspective and overview to be helpful. We've given it considerable thought. We have worked a lot in this area, and we know that these things are actually the things that are important in order to be successful in your ERP implementations. And I think the slide I want to end up here is to say that if you want to be in a situation where we utilize and exploit basically the opportunity in cloud, then it's actually to make sure that we are in control of these 4 main disciplines, and that isn't only for ERP, that goes for any systems. If we're capable of doing that, then we can continuously improve and stay compliant always. And I think that's where we all want to go at the end of the day. 4 minutes before time. This concludes, let's say, the content part of the presentation. Before I let everybody go, and I can see that we have no questions coming in. A few questions coming in, so I don't see those. What I think we're going to do, subject to time, so I can take some of the, let's say that we are easy to answer, is around the CSA. So the question is CSA current now? Is it still in draft? It's a work in progress. So we did see the first elements coming out, and we saw also elements coming out of, let's say, the task force around it, but it's not officially approved yet, but still good enough to show the trends of the industry. And yes, the next question is it only for devices? It comes out of the Center of Devices, so it applies to devices. But then again, so did 21 CFR Part 11. So I think again, it's a good place to get the trends for the regulatory bodies here. So, but it is of course with those disclaimers that we have it there. I think the last couple of questions we have some around the number of processes that we have within operation maintenance. What are these? And the recommendations from our side here is to look at the standards like ITIL, look at the whole process framework on that. And if you have any more questions around that, then send me an email, and then I'll give you the list of the processes that we are normally looking after when we do ERP implementation. So thank you very much for those questions. We have more cloud-related events coming up soon. I talked about the ECM one. It will be on March 24th. It will be the contents resembling what we have here, but related to ECM. And then we will be throwing a couple of let's call them in-person events where we can see people really in the eyes, and they can see us in the eyes. And we have a couple of those in May, starting in Copenhagen on May 4th, and then going on to May 17th in Frankfurt. Where we will have ERP cases in 3 of them, and an ECM case in the last one. And here we will have the opportunity to dig into more detail on the documents, the artifacts, the rationals, the reasons, and all this stuff. So much more specific than what we've done today. So on that note, I want to thank you for the participation. You behaved well, I think. On this seminar, and it's also easy to say when you're not having any feedback from the crowd. If you have more questions, then reach out to us, info@epista.com. Thank you very much for the attention.